IDEC are working up, and I think that there's a real need out there for loans that are under $100,000 for existing businesses that aren't looking to create any new jobs. They're just looking to stabilize what they have, and we don't have a product for that niche right now.
Do you think there are several looking for under $100,000?
I think so. Yes.
And if I could just jump in here real quick, just this morning in the Kansas City Star, the headline is Casey's micro loan program giving businesses a big boost. And they talk about loans of, I believe it was anywhere from 12 to 38. I mean, they were really getting small in terms of the size of their loans. So I think we have some other examples that we can look at in terms of how we might change our program. But certainly Kansas City, Missouri seems to have started what is a very successful micro loan Here it is. Kansas City's micro loans averaged $12,000 and capped at about $50,000. So, I mean, this is really much smaller than our revolving loan fund has been. My question would be, is there room for both? The big ones for big developments and the small ones for the person who wants to just enhance their business but is not going to meet the RLF criteria.
Yeah, and I think in the ideal world, the answer is yes. There's room for both. I think with the EDA requirements the way they are, we'll forever be in this pattern of holding the money, but inherently we're always going to be out of. Right, we're going to be way beyond that 25% capital investment. So we're constantly going to take a hit in terms of auditing results from the EDA because we're going to have more funds sequestered because we're not able to make those loans until there's a large enough time that passes by and we have another large project that can come in and take advantage of that money. So I think it's that the exercise we're doing is service current loans and put more funds into sequestration for the EDA, as opposed to what are we really doing? Are we actively engaged with potential loan dollars out in the community? Instead of waiting for that next big deal, can we actually be proactive and go engage small business with a different product? Same concept, and I'm not trying to throw this program under the bus by any means, because there's certainly some aspects of this program that are fantastic, like the 75% subprime interest rate. I mean, we've done loans for, Charles, 10, 15-year terms at 2.5, 2.75% interest. Fantastic for those 5 projects over the last 3 years that we're able to either fit into the niche or work the EDA over to help them compromise on our own policy to get it to work. So I guess that's a long-winded answer to answer you. Yes, there's room for both of them. I would see us being much more proactive in one role versus kind of a reactive or waiting in continuing the program as it is today.
Commissioner Townsend.
Thank you. We're talking about abandoning the structure of this RLF through the EDA. What would that mean? What would that leave us with in terms of money or the program? I know there are people who contact me within the 1st District who are desirous of loans and to help an existing business, and the dollar amounts that they talk about are more in the range of what Commissioner McKiernan has mentioned. So as I hear you explain the current program and setup, it doesn't sound like a lot of the constituents in my area would make the qualifications or would qualify for the loans. So what are we saying if we abandon the structure? Are we eventually having to tell EDA this is not working for us? What happens to the money that's in sequester already? And I see a number here that we contributed, the UG, $225,000. Is that money still available to be put into some other microfund, small business pot?
That's a great question, and I don't think we've got to that spot with the EDA yet. We've certainly had plenty of discussions with them that they know our frustration level with administering this program, and that we're at that crossroads. And if we terminate the agreement with them, we've not sent them any sort of notification yet that, hey, we've done this research and we know that the city of Kansas City, Kansas had put $225,000 in there initially. I would certainly have no problem making that request back to them to say, hey, over time, and Charles, how much is in in sequestered funds right now?
$673,587.17.
So, and they initially put 625 in. So, I think if they wanted the sequestered funds, but give us an opportunity to recapture as much of our initial investment as we could. We just haven't had that discussion with them yet, but I would certainly anticipate, if we get direction, that we would engage them and say, we'd like to terminate the program or the agreement as it is now. What are the odds of, could we get our initial investment back and maybe offer some program that's very similar but without the stipulations that the EDA plan puts in place?
Because how much leverage or latitude would we, the UG, have to make some type of alteration in the program? Isn't that federally controlled?
Yeah, that's the problem is their program is, they're pulling from their federal policies, and so we could try to go and legislate or help legislate change at that level, but how long is that process? And in the meantime, we're still in that cycle of more funds being pushed into sequestered and not able to make loans.
Commissioner Townsend, are you asking then where would we get the money to lend if we decided to come up with a different criteria? Is that your question?
Not really. I've heard Mr. Brakovic talk about maybe coming up with some other vehicle. I'm just wondering what our options are. It doesn't sound like with the current structure, number one, we have a lot of input in changing it. It doesn't sound like it's benefiting as many people as it was intended to in terms of small businesses looking for small amounts. So, what are we going to do with it? If there's some alternatives, well, I guess the first thing is, do we stay with this or not? That's it. Because when I looked at these numbers, with the exception of this number 5 Dynasty for $17,000, most of these don't look like what I had in mind for small business. People who are coming to you from mom and pop, start up or improvement on their business. So it just seems like we're bound by restrictions that we can't change anyway. Now, with the loans that are currently out, repayment would come to us, or what's happening? What would happen with that?
I mean, I think that's what we need to be able to sit down and talk through with the EDA representatives, whether they want us to continue to service those or they service them themselves or there's a third party. I think for your earlier question is probably spot on for where the same question we're asking. Are we at a spot where we need to walk away from the program as it is, and what does that entail? So what kind of notice do we need to give the Economic Development Administration? Giving them notice, should we be preemptive and say we'd like to get our initial investment back? Those are all the pieces that we're really looking to get some direction on.
Well, to me, it seems like those are the alternatives that we should be considering, because I don't see where we have a lot of latitude. We being UG have a lot of latitude to change those things so it would benefit the group of people that it seems it was intended to benefit, or we hope that it would benefit.
And maybe I didn't do a very good job earlier of explaining that, but I think in terms of manipulating our own policy to keep it in check with the EDA's guidelines, we've already lowered the thresholds on all the ratios as low as we can. And then working with WIDEC, we've changed the whole marketing of this program to be geared more towards the fixed assets. And even doing all of those things in combination, we're still not experiencing very much success in offering this program the way it's currently structured with
Was
EDA.
there a limit on the amount of money that someone could borrow?
floor
A
to
floor,
it.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, there was a cap at 200, but I don't know. That was the
What was
highest,
the
but what was
floor?
the lowest amount? Was there any?
There was no cap, lowest.
To say if someone needed 25,000, that wouldn't even, it sounds like, meet your threshold for 50,000 and a job, maybe, yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's a good example. So if someone wanted 25,000 from this program, they would have to have a private match of $50,000 funds from wherever, plus it create at least one job.
Thank you.
And that's some of the reasons that I myself would like to consider the concept, but see if we can execute it differently. See maybe if we can learn from the city of Kansas City, Missouri, or the city of Des Moines, Iowa, has created what they call the Neighborhood Finance Corporation. It's a CDFI, a Community Development Financial Institution, which works with the city government, parallel to it, but with the city government. Now, in this case, they provide small loans for community development purposes, let's say for housing improvement, housing construction. But what I want to know is, if we were to emulate that structure, why couldn't we provide those loans for both community development as well as business development purposes? So are there structures that are available that we could take and modify to create the kind of a lending program that I think at least would be very beneficial to small business as well as community development corporations as well as homeowners within the city?
And I know that staff has researched other programs as well, whether they're facade improvements for businesses or, you know, we're an existing business, we need roof repairs. And, you know, most of our incentives, they're structured to help a business take advantage of an incremental change, whether it's in their property tax or in their sales tax, but we just don't have that product to help them bridge some sort of financial gap when a private lending institution just won't give them the 100,000 that they need to make a repair. They can only get 60 or 70. And so how can we structure a product to service that type of need, regardless of what it is?
How risky are the small microloans you're talking about?
Pretty risky. I mean, there's a reason they're coming to you for gap financing. And then that's one of the issues even with the EDA is, you know, certain organizations that come for these loans, there needs to be a guarantor on it. So if it's a not-for-profit, their board members are probably not likely to put up a personal guarantee for their not-for-profit to get $50,000, $60,000, and rightfully so.
Right.
And so I think you'd kind of get into that same discussion, you know. But again, if it's a lower amount, does that mitigate some of the risk because it is a lower amount? And I think you still have to do the way we service these currently is Greg at WIDEC puts together a loan review committee. I would assume we would continue with something like that where we have a third party really look at these just like a banking institution would and say, you know, is this a good risk to take or not? And not just count on staff reviewing that and handing out money.
But they're still higher risk loans, correct?
Oh, I think so. Yes, yes.
Yeah. Well, I just have some general comments. You know, Commissioner McKiernan and I have talked about this at great length, and I've talked to a couple other commissioners about this. I approach this from a bigger perspective than just the revolving loan fund. Okay? So when we went to our strategic planning, you know, it seems like sort of an elementary comment to make, but I think it was our mayor that made the comment, there are only so many ways that our government brings in revenue. Basically, property tax and sales tax were the two sources of revenue that he talked about. And, you know, obviously we can increase those, but that doesn't always necessarily mean our constituents are going to get anything more for what they're paying. So what has been on my mind are ways that we can increase or broaden revenue streams to the government and also utilize it in a way that enhances economic development. So one thing I've noticed that government has traditionally done is when no one else will do it, come knocking at our door because we'll do it. So if there's a gap or whatever, or if there's something missing in a deal, usually we get involved. They're high risk usually. I know that you guys do a good job trying to mitigate that, an excellent job at that, but the reality is they're usually high risk. And we're usually the last to be paid back on a deal because we want the deal to happen. Well, I'm just suggesting, and I don't really even know that it's possible, but, and I know Commissioner McKiernan and I have talked about it, is that maybe the government get more progressive in the way of lending money on less risky deals. So I'm just gonna give you an example. This is open to a lot of criticism, so feel free to jump on. But it's just off the top of my head. So, for example, I can only speak to my district, but you're familiar with the 39 Rainbow development, the Five Guys Burgers that's being done by Lane 4. And they have phase 2 that's across from the medical center, that involves the School of Nursing and then some more retail in the lower level. I'm guessing that that's a $60 million development. So let's make an assumption they had to borrow $20 million on that deal from a bank. And let's make an assumption that given where interest rates are right now, let's say they're paying 6.5% to 7%. We'll say 7%. On a deal like that, I'm not sure why the unified government, when they're negotiating incentives with Lane 4, we're already in the deal with the incentives that we've offered on that particular project. So why wouldn't we look at being the lender of the $20 million? We can use a general obligation bond, a taxable general obligation bond. We're charged 2% right now on that bond, and they'd have to be charged 7%. Let's charge them 4.5%. We instantly start to get payments back. We put this, the excess revenue, sorry about my lack of business terminology, take this excess revenue or interest payments that are coming in, set it up in a fund, and use that money to do these microloans that Commissioner Townsend is referring to. My concern is that we just do microloans. We're kind of doing the same thing we've always done, in the sense we're taking those high-risk deals that people traditionally don't want to do, so they come to us. This way, we have a source of revenue for the project we're trying to do, and it's instantaneous because they're going to be making payments back to us like a mortgage right away, as opposed to the other types of incentives that we do here at the government. So, for example, right now we have a program, NRA, that offers you a tax abatement on a piece of property. So if Commissioner McKiernan builds a new house, he's eligible for a property tax rebate of 95%, we'll just say 100%, for 10 years. So this government has to wait 10 years to get any money back on this new house that he built. It's a great incentive, absolutely brings people to our community. Hopefully they're buying things, which increases the sales tax we're getting in our community. I'm not belittling that program. I think it's a fantastic program. What I'm saying, though, is I'm looking for ways to get money now so that we can do things now and do projects with bigger projects that have impact. So that's my first example. I'll give you one more example that's not a fair market Lane 4 kind of deal. So it's no secret I run a not-for-profit called ONDA. We do infill housing. We recently, meaning Commissioner McKiernan, Commissioner Walters, and myself, have been part of this committee to look at all the property tax delinquent property in the city. And clearly, especially east of 635, this has been a problem. So one of the ways that I see this fund as being helpful is, say there are 50 property tax delinquent properties in Rosedale. And I take, which there are, I'll tell you. So we run those through our land bank process. The not-for-profit gets those 50 homes. If they have the ability to come to the unified government and borrow money at a lower interest rate to turn those houses around, whether it be rehab or new construction, you're broadening our tax base. You're generating revenue from the lending that you're doing. I mean, it truly is a win-win-win all the way around. Now, I will tell you, in fairness, I don't think that our government should be in the business of loaning money to not-for-profits if the deal isn't proven to be lucrative. I mean, it has to show the propensity to be successful. I don't think this should be some social project. The point is to develop this economic development fund set aside for either small business microloans or for whatever we decide there is a more social need for. Not that small business absolutely helps our community. I'm just saying, I think that whatever we decide how we want to use that revenue is irrelevant to me. I'm saying I'm concerned more about how to build that fund up so that, all of our districts can have access to that money. Does that make sense?
It does, but it seems you've now introduced the tantalizing, several new possibilities into this, broadening from the microloan exclusively into much larger lending. And of course, 1,000 questions pop into my mind that would just need to be worked through and need to be answered. How does that affect our overall debt to assets ratio and things like that in terms of the initial borrowing of that money to then relend, and how we manage all of that? So you've introduced the aspect here that we might actually use a loan program to generate revenue that can then be redirected maybe into the microloan program or forgivable loans or the higher risk loans that would be smaller in dollar amount. So using the large ones to fund the small. That's an interesting twist.
Or just for the revenues generated to go into the general fund.
Could do that,
Yeah.
absolutely. I was saying that simply because Commissioner, Townsend brought up the microloans and George brought him up that there's a need there. I'm just saying absolutely could go into the general fund. That was my original idea, is that we need another source of revenue, coming into the unified government other than raising people's taxes. So I think it's a great opportunity for us, in particular right now. And we have plenty of deals where I could see having incredible impact in urban areas that we haven't had before. I just see it as the biggest tool for helping us turn our tax base around, in particular in those areas where the delinquency is very high. As a not-for-profit that does this, I'll be the first to tell you, the 1 and 2 house infills that we're doing are not gonna change a community in my lifetime. We're gonna have to come up with another tool that has a greater impact on this community. It's just not gonna happen.
So as I said in a meeting the other day, good research always generates more questions than it answers. In this case, good discussion generates more questions than it answers. I think our question is, how do we move forward from here to begin to sketch out because we've talked about larger loans and smaller loans. We've talked about community development as well as business. We've talked about large developments and small developments, the government borrowing and then lending versus a parallel organization doing both of those. I guess the question is, how do we move forward from here, and who can begin to help sketch out some of the framework of all of that with the pros and cons to each step?
I guess I could probably take, if there's 3 items that are coming from this in the different areas, one is the initial item that the staff has come from. So I guess I might come back to this, all 3 points that have been raised here to this. We open up our discussion with the EDA about discontinuing that program. We have a general framework from our current RLF program about doing a micro loan program, so we'd want to tweak that, change it, and direct it toward the small one. And then I think it would be working on some guidelines that would be for this larger loan program. And I know you brought this conversation up and engaged Lou Levin, our CFO, about this.
And bond counsel.
And bond counsel. So thinking about some guidelines that maybe we could come back in that start to program this, because this item would be a budgetary item where you guys would have to look at it and say, let's include this in, let's go out and issue a loan as part of our budget or issue bonds. Maybe we're doing it that way, or maybe it's just on a project by project basis, so it really wouldn't become budgetary from that standpoint.
So, not to interrupt you, Doug, I don't think it is part of our budget process. I think what it is, it's like typical development deal. Like we just issued IRB bonds, we just did it. We didn't plan on North Point doing any kind of financing with North Point during our budget cycle. I think people are making it too complicated. And I will tell you what I would like to see happen. I mean, it's always good to try to develop a framework, okay? But sometimes developing a framework can take a whole lot of time, and then you end up doing a deal within that framework, and you end up changing it all anyway. So I would like to see us actually look at moving forward with a pilot project. And this originated on the agenda at my request to the mayor, because at the time I had a pilot project I was gonna bring to this committee. But we decided not to do that. So I think while you're working on this, just know that you all can vote no, but at some point in time, I probably will bring a pilot project forward. Because I think this is one of those programs where we're gonna have to go through it together once to see how it works. And sort of the way, Brian, I envision this, and I talked to one of you too about this tonight, is I envision this where if I bring a project forward, each commissioner would either have an appointment to this committee or they can appoint themselves, where we're all working together on this one pilot project for a year. And at the end of that year, each appointment from each district would have the opportunity or the wherewithal to bring their own project forward for their own district because they have gone through the process. I really think we have a lot of the process in place if we treat it like a regular economic development deal. I think the only difference is that we're actually gonna put ourselves in a position to make some money. You're not gonna loan North Point money at 2%. You're gonna loan them more money at 4% to offset what they would pay a private lender. And we're gonna keep that money, and we're gonna do whatever this commission decides to do with that pot of money that comes in.
While I appreciate a pilot project, a beta test, I can say for myself, I'd like to know more of the framework. I'd like to have more definition and clarity before I could really get behind a pilot project. I'd like for us to have better sketched out what we think are gonna be the operating framework of this program. And once we've done that, and we're all cool with that, then I would absolutely get behind a pilot project. But another thing you said was commissioners bring forward projects. And there's a part of me that says, I'd like to take myself out of that equation and not be standing in between a business or a community development group. And, I'd like to get myself and not be the middleman in that. And that's just kind of the thought that went through my head is, how can I facilitate that happening more organically without me being a piece of that puzzle? I don't know.
Right, except the only problem is, Commissioner, is that nobody's doing that. Nobody's coming forward in your district or
Not
my
yet.
district or Gail's district.
Not yet.
Right, and so that's part of the problem. So sometimes as a leader in a community, you have to be the one taking the first step to be able to begin to make that happen. And if you don't understand how that happens, it's pretty hard to be in our position and set good policy so others will follow. So that's all I'm saying, that would be the concern.
I just want to clarify if I can, because you've kind of laid out two different loan programs. I mean, one is using the example of like Lane Forest, they came into 39th and Rainbow project. And knowing if there's a will of the commission that we try to insert something like this in a future development plan from a stable developer, that isn't really one where we have to go find something. We can just kind of use it as something in our toolbox to kind of see what happens, and then it comes back as part of the equation when we work on a deal, and see how that shakes out. Because they come in with their private financing so much, and we just say, well, what are you getting your private financing for, or kind of know what the market is, and say, well, we'd like to be on that side of the equation too. If you want to get our TIF or our CID money or something like that, then you're going to take a loan from us, and this is how much you're going to pay. And we think it's still a better deal for you, or maybe it's about the same as you would from your bank, but you get it there. So we could work that concept, and that's one path. And that's I guess what we're classifying as a non-risk or a lower risk type loan, where we just make money on it, and that's all there is out of that equation. then there's your nonprofit community project side, which that's the one where I'm, you've got your idea, okay, have everybody go develop a project, come back, and they promote it, and we issue a loan to it. That's kind of a different equation there, because I guess it depends on what the project is. And
Yeah,
then we
I
could
don't
have, if
think-
it's 8 different commissioners do it, probably 8 different projects.
That's right, and it depends on whatever the need in that area. If there's a need for $10,000 microloans, it might be a different scenario versus another neighborhood that might need massive housing redevelopment. It just depends on what's brought forward. Whoever brings it forward, and whatever the project is, at minimum, I would suggest that it is held all to the same standard. And I think that how you're gonna be able to do that is because these people are gonna be able to access large amounts of capital for a very reduced cost, which is gonna make the development more affordable and more doable, which is gonna make that more affordable for whether you're a fair market business or whether you're a not-for-profit. The cost of doing business, regardless of who you are, is the same. You see what I'm saying?
I do.
It's exactly the same. The bank doesn't give me a better rate because I go there and say I'm a not-for-profit versus I'm lane 4. So I'm just saying it should be handled in exactly the same way. It really doesn't have to be that complicated, and actually it would be reverting back to what we've always done traditionally, which is take on those high-risk projects if we had a different standard for our not-for-profits than we do for the fair market. I see this really as a way of leveling the playing field for districts, I'm gonna pick on Commissioner Walters here, who don't have not-for-profits, who have areas that could really benefit from a not-for-profit entity that would be willing to do housing redevelopment in a particular area, but don't have access to those. I see a way for him with his contacts as an architect to go out and meet with some of these developers and promote his area and say, we could offer the financing for a housing redevelopment project at a reduced interest rate if you would come and facilitate this project for us. They could bring that project forward.
I'm keen on your last comment of at a reduced interest rate.
Right. Which is significant when you're talking about a large, impactful housing redevelopment plan. 1 and 2 houses, not gonna matter.
So is it possible, and you earlier identified 3 points, is it possible that we move this forward, pick this discussion up again, but in between now and our next meeting, we move forward on the question of do we continue with the revolving loan fund fully, partially, or not at all? I think that was the original question, is let's see if we can get some clarity to that at our next by our next meeting.
Well, I'm taking that from a direction that we should go ahead and engage the EDA to say, we're looking very strongly at disengaging, and if we do, what happens?
Excellent.
Yeah, I agree.
Yes.
Okay.
And part 2 of that would be to look at how this larger dollar loan program might be structured, what the pros and cons of various ways of structuring it, how it might work, so there's more definition and more clarity to the structure of it.
Yeah.
Bring that back for conversation, and then parallel to that, or in addition to that, the third piece, which is the microloan piece, which would be much smaller in dollars and might have differences in terms of interest rates and terms and whatnot.
Really replace the RLF that we have today, but make it much more practical for use within the community and small business.
Correct. Is that something that staff can begin to talk and bring back? And given our shortened timeline for materials for the February meeting, I don't know that we'll have it by then, but begin to move with all deliberate speed to start putting that together?
Yeah, we can engage EDA. We don't know whether we'll have a conversation with them or not be able to get a conversation with them in 2.5 weeks, but there's really nothing that has to be on the agenda maybe regarding that. That might be February 2nd before Charles can talk with them, and he could come back and report the findings of that rather than have a report that's in our document. And I think that kind of drives where we might go with our other smaller owned self-initiated RLF program. And then I think the larger one is one for us to continue maybe having some internal discussion and then come back with you all and discuss more.
And Commissioner McGee, if you could participate in those discussions as well and kind of lay out your vision for how that would work and help clarify the organization of that? Thank you.
Okay.
I think that's it.
I think we got it.
I think we got it.
All right.
Thank you so much. That brings us to the next section of our agenda, which is outcomes. And this section only has one item on it, and this is the item that Commissioner Murguia alluded to earlier, and that is a report on how, it says report of housing with income restrictions, but I believe it's also a report of housing development with various incentives used.
Yes, sir.
Mike Grimm and Charles Brockman.
Good evening. I'm going to take just a few minutes to review the data on this table I think you all have in your packet. Residential units added in Kansas City, Kansas, 2009 through 2013, and that's through November 2013, so almost 5 years of data, by the type of incentive. So as you can see in the columns, we have 2009 through November 2013. In the rows, or the sections, we have we break the data down into single-family, duplex, and multifamily. So just to follow some data across, 2009, there were a total of 101 permits issued in Kansas City, Kansas. And of those, you can see the breakout that had incentives applied to those permits. So we had 20 NRA, and that's in the form of a tax rebate. There were no NSP projects. There were 12 that used home funds, and then the LIHTC, or the Section 42, had 0, and Habitat for Humanity built 0 that year. So for a total of 32 permits of the 101 that had incentives. So just doing the math, that's 32% of single-family permits issued in 2009 had incentive tied to it. So then going across, we have the totals for the 5 years. The 123 had incentives out of the 501 permits. That's 25% of single-family permits issued for that time frame had incentives. Under duplexes, we had in 2010 and 2011. What we see there are the Pemberton duplexes across from West Wyandotte. So those were all LIHTC projects. Well, it was a LIHTC project, but not all the units had income restrictions. Some were market rate. And then that last section, multifamily, we can talk about the data. Really, 2013 is the only year that had incentives. So maybe I'll step through that. On the number of permits, you see the number 8. 6 of those permits were for the buildings at the North Point project. One was the St. Margaret's conversion, and one was the Horace Mann conversion. So the 444 units, 306 were for the North Point, 108 for St. Margaret's, and 30 for Horace Mann. Now, those were the total. But then below that, you look at the permits with incentives, and that one, the LIHTC, that was St. Margaret's. So 44 of the 108 units at St. Margaret's is LIHTC, or income restricted. And the NRA is 18th Street Plaza project. So, again, each of these sections have overall counts of permits, and those that had incentives tied to it and percentages. The last 4 rows just sum all of those. So if we look at the total residential units for that time frame, 1,334 permits issued, 241 had an incentive tied to it, for 18% of all those units having some sort of incentive. So that's the data. If there's any questions, I can try and answer those. And I want to thank Charles. We both worked on this, and he had a lot of input on this too.
So this chart's a little bit hard for me to follow, I'm sorry. You do a great job, Mike, but this one's a little bit hard, I guess. So let's just look at 2009 again. So, or I'm sorry, look at 2010, that's easier for me. Home funds is our low-income housing. Then 15, LIHTC, that's low-income housing, and 4. So 21 of the 96 units were low-income, is that correct?
Had a low-income component to,
Yeah, that's
The
what I
incentive.
wanted to know.
Right.
And do you know the general geographic area of those 21 low-income units?
yeah, I mean, the big one, the 15, that's the CHWC house to home. Those are gonna be East 635. Habitat, I have the addresses. I'm pretty sure they
They're
all
east
are.
of 635.
Correct.
So how many of these that are not of the 21 low income that fall into the 74 or 75 homes that were not low income, how many of those were built east of 635?
I don't have those numbers in front of me, but probably most of those were elsewhere.
So probably
East,
zero.
west, perhaps. I'd have to
Yeah.
double check.
That's my concern. That is my concern. We cannot have an economic divider line in our county where if you're poor, you live east of 635, and if you're rich, you live west of 635. It cannot be like that. It's gonna end up causing us bigger problems as we move forward. So when we make decisions about low-income housing tax credit deals, we cannot build every single one of them east of 635, or every home house we build cannot be east of 635. It creates an instability in a community. You guys, we learned this in the 60s, in the 70s, in the 80s, in the 90s. You cannot stack poor people on top of poor people. I don't care how you slice it. I don't care how the deal is structured. I've been sold a bag of goods over and over and over again on this commission about why their low-income deal is different than the low-income deal done in 1980. There's no difference. It's low-income people, and you're stacking them on top of each other.
You and I have had this conversation many times before, and I would counter, we're not stacking them. They're already stacked. I think that if you look at the median income and you break it out by census tract or whatever, there are areas of our city already, without building any housing projects, they're already there, where the median incomes are higher and the median incomes are lower. And I was looking through something from LISC that said that nationwide, half of all renters pay more than 30% of their income for housing. 1 in 4 pays more than 50% of their income for housing, generally for paying rent. And what I would counter is, if there are people who don't have the means to pay for a very expensive house or a very expensive apartment, low-income housing, subsidized housing, is one way to improve the housing stock and to do it in a way that's affordable to that person, because one of the ideas behind the low-income housing tax credit is that by building and providing housing that, for example, would take no more than 30% of somebody's income, that person then can redirect the rest of their income to other things like building wealth. And certainly that was, now we can argue whether or not that actually happens, but that's been one of the ideas behind the creation of the low-income housing tax credit program, was that by providing low or affordable, we won't say low income, by providing affordable housing, we can then give those people a leg up and an opportunity to build wealth and raise their income.
So my only comment back is, that's great. Why does all that have to be east of 635? That's all I'm asking. I mean, I hear everything you're saying. I believe in everything that you're saying. I'm just saying that if all that opportunity is out there and that is what's going to make a difference, why can we not pass any of that out in western Wyandotte County?
Well, and again, as you and I have talked before, I think we're kind of getting in personal opinion, this is just personal opinion, we're a little misdirected looking at the housing piece of it, the Section 42 piece of it. The real solution is raise the buying power. of the people who are east of 635, and we will eliminate the need for Section 42 housing. There won't be a need for low-income housing tax credits because everyone will be able to afford whatever housing they want. But that's a much bigger issue than low-income housing tax credits. And I'll be honest with you, it's beyond the scope of my pea brain to figure out how to do that in a quick and meaningful way. So we have a couple of things, however, that we did put on the agenda from starting our discussion last week, and that was to reconsider the scoring system and to reconsider the procedure that we had put in place a couple of years ago, that a project that reaches a certain score in terms of applying for low-income housing tax credits would then get our letter of support automatically and pass through. So one of the discussions that we want to open up is, do we want to change our scoring system, or do we want to change the criteria for getting an automatic letter of support from the unified government when applying for low-income housing tax credits?
I simply want to be able to vote no when I want to vote no and for it to count. And whether I lose because other commissioners vote yes, that's fine. But I want to be able to vote no and not hear from staff that we have the threat of a lawsuit if we vote no.
But, I'm trying to clarify this again. My understanding is that the set of criteria, the scoring system was developed in order to create a fair, equitable system for a developer who is applying for the low-income tax credits to say, okay, in order for my project to get a letter of approval to the state, if I meet these criteria, then I have satisfied the requirements that the unified government has set for me. And so every developer who comes to the table has the same set of criteria, looks at those, and does their best to meet the criteria. It is scored, and if they meet those criteria, then it moves on. It's the state that approves, not the unified government that approves. The unified government would just simply say, based upon what we have already set forth, this set of criteria, this developer has met this, so as far as we're concerned, this is an eligible project. We're forwarding it to the state as an eligible project. Am I getting that right?
Yeah, our criteria is a letter of support. So the state requires, or they've stated they look for our letter of support when they consider the other projects for approval.
I think it's pretty highly unlikely that the state is going to fund a project that the county says no to.
Yeah, that's why, if they don't get our letter of support, that's why the developer is looking, has to be done, right. I don't think there's anything that says they can't,
Right.
but I'm not aware that they've done it.
Has the reverse ever happened? We've supported a project and the state turned it down?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yes.
And that's mainly, there's 50 projects put in and they can only
Right.
fund 10. It's a dollar ratio issue.
How often do we change our criteria or update our criteria based on changes to market conditions and things like that?
Well, Charles, we
change.
went through it last year.
Yes, sir, we did it in 2012
Annually
and
then?
2013, not annually. There were some questions about one in particular, what can we do to ensure that, say, it goes through, we give it the blessing and resolution of support, how do we know it's going to be completed? Well, the adoption of a developer's agreement was put in place as a past commissioner wanted that completed, so that was added to. We tried changing a couple other things and they were rescinded, but we've done.
It's set for annual review. The commission does not always actively take a change on an annual. We have the past couple of years. We probably went a couple of years prior to that where we didn't do anything, and, so.
And for Mr. Alvey's benefit, because you weren't here, I don't think you were here at the last meeting, some of the other questions that I think Commissioner Murguia was just wondering about was, should we consider things like geographic proximity of other low-income housing developments? Should we look at density? How would a project affect the density of low-income units? How might a project affect the median income in a census tract or in a district or in an area? How might it affect median housing value in a census tract or a district or an area?
And I can tell you it significantly does. It is what I do for a living. I am currently in the middle of a low-income housing tax credit development I personally am doing. And I can tell you, I just brought a grocery store to District 3. I can tell you I have I've spent an incredible amount of time interacting with retailers. And your median income of a particular geographic area has significant impact on whether or not you're going to get retailers or not. That's why I am completely opposed to continuing to approve low-income housing tax developments, whether we have them or not. It is killing our median income. Now, the difference is if somebody is to come forward and was to say, I'm going to take out these 20 units that are old and dilapidated, because we all know we have plenty of those kinds of units. They're old and junky, and, we're going to wipe those out, and we're going to build 20 new low-income housing units. I'd be fine with that. But that's not what's happening. What's happening is people are converting things to more low-income housing, so we're increasing the number of low-income housing units available, which draws the low-income housing population to a particular area. It's not just meeting the needs of the people that already live in our community. It's about attracting more low-income people to our community, which affects our ability to get retail, which is, I know personally what a struggle that is.
There's a piece of data I would love. Do we have data that says that people with a lower income, with a lower median income, move to Wyandotte County because we use low-income housing tax credits? If the data are out there, I'd love to have them. It would be very interesting if that's the case. My question would be, you said earlier, I just want to be able to vote no. Well, how about this? How about we work up a system where we're all happy with how the system works and nobody has to vote no because we've come to an agreement on a system that works to provide affordable housing for people whose incomes are low, but still respects the geography, the proximity, the mean and median incomes and house values and things like that.
I think that was the point I was asking toward. It would seem to me that you're really looking to craft the criteria differently that would prevent the stacking of the poor on top of the poor, if I'm right on that. Can that be put in the criteria?
Right. If you can make that, I'm usually pretty open-minded about trying to find a way to do that. I just don't know that there is. I mean, short of writing in there, for every unit of LIHTC you want to build, you have to take one out. And then how many deals are really going to happen? They're not going to happen, I'll tell you right now. So I just don't think they will if we make that a requirement. But I would vote for it every time if that was the case, no matter where it's at.
Help me understand this one. So you're saying that, for example, for the sake of argument, we have 100 units right now that are classified as having, as falling under the Section 42 criteria for affordable housing.
Right.
If we want to build another one of those 100 has to go away.
Right.
So what if we have 100 units, but there's really 200 people who qualify by income to live in those units?
Where are those other people living now? Obviously they have to live somewhere, and that's obviously not in Wyandotte County if they're looking for a place like that to live. Because they would have a place to live if they lived in Wyandotte County.
Again, I go back to the argument that they are living here, but they're paying such a high price for the housing that they're in that they have no ability to build wealth. They have no ability to redirect their money. Not saying that it's true, but there are some people who would even say that the lack of affordable housing contributes to the problem of chronic homelessness.
All I can go by is I've worked in infill housing in Wyandotte County, in particular in your neighborhood, for CHWC and currently for ONDA. for 11 years now. And that, I've never seen that be the case. I've seen where people have been overcharged to live in property that was substandard. I've seen that. But those people then didn't turn around and seek out subsidized housing to reduce the rent that they were paying. There were other factors of why that they lived in that kind of housing. So I would just tell you, I don't know, I'm only one person, but I've done it for 11 years, and I can tell you that's not what I've seen. But that's just what I've seen.
Yes, ma'am.
Do the criteria that you just articulated and what Mr. Alves was getting at, what Commissioner Regia was getting at in terms of the impact of these things, are those criteria currently part of the evaluation program?
No, they're not.
Because that does seem to be moving toward the direction of giving the commissioners a voice in what comes and goes in the low-income housing. To me, it sounds like a reasonable thing to evaluate. Because I get the net increase or not of this. And I've heard the same thing in First District. Retailers want to come to areas where they know people have disposable income. You know, it becomes a vicious cycle of why they don't. So I think that would be a reasonable starting point to evaluate the current criteria and look at the types of questions we can ask about the impact and numbers and all that geographically.
So, well, we have the opportunity to review and potentially revise the scoring criteria for Section 42 applications that come for our letter of support. If we are agreed as a committee that we want to get into that, we can distribute the current criteria to each commissioner, ask each commissioner to look those over before our next meeting, and to come up with what they think are useful additions or modifications to the existing criteria. How could we change the scoring system so that it better meets your concerns and sets up a situation where if somebody passes these criterion, everybody can vote yes, and they feel good about voting yes because they know that it's going to contribute to our community in a positive way.
And I'll just say, this dates back somewhat. This is excellent discussion on the topic. When we originally developed the criteria was a time when the governing body really got into it more than just being, here's a project came before you, and I will say we were very arbitrary. I mean, in the way the commission looked at it, they really had not said, what do we want to get from low-income housing tax projects? After we went through the criteria stage, then that's how that came about. You know, we'll sit down and while it's not a one-for-one reduction, we do give more points for somebody if they come in and they do reconstruction. If you demo a project, something on site, and it may not have been housing, it may have been just some old warehouse that's sitting there, and you clear something and then build up, you get points for that. So I mean, entering this piece into the equation, that whether you want to say as a qualifier to say you can't even start unless you're eliminating one, and it's one for one, and that's the only way we consider it, or you build it into the criteria that says in order to get to your 50 points, you'll get more by reducing and taking things out to put some in. So there's a lot of ways we can go about working on that. And I will say right now, we've had our last couple of projects have come in close to 60 points, Charles, and when we started this, they were throwing their hands up, coming to us and going, they couldn't hardly get to 50, they're sitting at 47 and looking at different things. Well, they stepped up to the plate, realized that they were going to get the endorsement of this governing body, and then we kind of did this, we thought about this gold standard, but it's still kind of working its way through. The more points you get, the more glowing endorsement you'll get from the unified government. But I think having a criteria based on this discussion that makes it, you want to say it different, challenging, and clearly meeting your standards to get to 50 points, is what you want.
But again, the criteria there have to reflect the values of the governing body.
Right.
And
Yes.
so as you clarify and as these values change and develop, then they have to go back into the criteria. So the criteria probably have to be rewritten.
So Doug, what were the changes that happened in the projects that took them from a point where they were just barely getting 40 points to where they got well over 50? What kind of actual physical changes to the projects come to mind?
Charles, you might be able to remember that better than I. Haven't sat down and reviewed, or Mike, you guys review the applications?
Well, a lot of times, amenities play a factor in it.